Hey friends, welcome to Edgy Conversations today. Today's topic is, what story are we in? Barbara Brown Taylor will tell us that the most important ethical choice we make is the choice of which narratives we privilege. What are the ways in which we're framing our experience and our reality determines a great deal. And so this question, what story are we in, taken from a theological perspective, is a really important one to ask. So that's our topic of conversation today. What story are we in biblically? Are we in the wilderness? I hear that a lot. Is it Lent? Is it Good Friday? It's literally Advent right now, but it could be Advent. Is it a period of waiting, pregnant waiting? Is it Good Friday, a time of shock and grief? Holy Saturday? Is it Easter Sunday? Maybe the road to Emmaus. So that's the question this morning, and we've got our Edge staff team here to reflect on it. But I invite you to think about, what story do you see the church being in, the world being in, your own life being in today? So what do you think, folks? Carla, I see you unmuting.
Yeah, obviously I love this question. It's something that I think that what's really neat about this is that you can probably ask yourself this every other day, maybe every day, and in every context. And what I really like about this question is also, like, I might feel like I'm in one spot, but maybe my community of faith feels somewhere else. Maybe, someone sitting right beside me feels somewhere else, right? And so I think there's so much about context on this. And one thing, speaking with so many communities of faith, it's just, I've been hearing from them, a lot of them have been feeling that this is Lent. And it's been feeling that way because it's not just the 40 days of Lent, but it's over 40 years of Lent or wilderness. And so I think that in there's been a longing, a yearning for Easter and knowing what's coming. And it's been really interesting for me in the conversations of, like, what does Lent look like? Well, it does look like scarcity. And it does look like, cutting up the same pie differently. It does look like fasting, it does look like waiting. And so I think that in this time of starting from one story and just even reflecting upon when people are ready for the next story. So if we've been in this story for so long, what story are we waiting for? Or what story are we yearning for? Seems to be some pieces there. But let's start us at Lent and see where we go from there.
Thanks, Carla. Lent, it's not chronological. I'm thinking Advent, this kind of sense of being in the darkness. And that, I think that partly is the shadow of our own lack of intention to explore this question creatively around what story we're in. And not to see it as a time of expectation for something new, so that our eyes would be attuned to seeing the light as it emerges. But I love this question. And here's the thing, like, as we explore all these biblical images, we are bombarded with 1,000 narratives a day, right? In a time of we used to call it mass media. Now it's social media, and it's even more massive in the lives of many. That's the whole kind of best and worst of what happens on the internet. People sharing narratives about each other, about what's happening, about the world. And so it's a really, really critical question. And sometimes we can get the wrong biblical image. I think sometimes when we can take, if we get the wrong story, it can also blind us to what God is trying to place in front of us to bring our attention to. So I like this idea of Advent, that there's something pregnant about this time. There's something birthing and there's a light coming into the darkness. And so, those narrative, those messages in that narrative, prepare the way, or the people who sat in darkness have seen a great light. Where's the light? Get curious around where that light is shining. Anyway, Bronwyn, what do you think?
I've been more and more connecting with the Easter morning story. And I think specifically the women who go to the tomb and it's empty, and then come back to the disciples who are, really, really terrified and really grieving in the upper room, and trying to explain what they've seen, right? And so, because I find that I've seen these incredible stories of hope and renewal, or I don't know if you even know renewal. It's like a whole new, brand new thing around some of our church projects and innovation. But then there's this legitimate and very real fear that things have not worked out in a lot of congregations the way people wanted them to or thought they would. And so there's this real grieving happening, I think, and also disbelief that this is actually still part of God's plan. Like there's still actually ministry and faithful people, and like there's this great movement that is right about to start, or has all this potential, but that there's this real sort of lack of confidence too. I think a real legitimate lack of concern for what it would mean to step back outside and say, like, yes, Jesus was killed, but there's actually this whole new, there's still good news. There's still wonderful news here. And I think it's like that Easter morning where it's like, we're not quite ready to believe it. Like, it's really hard to believe that an empty tomb is actually like an exciting new.
I think kind of building off of that and pulling forward further into the biblical narrative, one of the spaces that we often talk about amongst ourselves is the road to Emmaus. And one of the things that has been sitting with me quite a bit is around the way that we listen and discern our calls in life and our next call, and the way that we notice God as a presence around us. Or quite literally on the road to Emmaus, how we notice the presence or lack thereof of Jesus in our midst. And part of that is the decision within ourselves to lean deeply into our faith and lean deeply into these moments of uncertainty and questioning, and where our reality just doesn't quite fit with what we think it should be. And I think all of us throughout this pandemic time have had the opportunity, you could call it an opportunity in a positive or a negative way, I guess, to really lean into what these questions around change are, and really deeply lean into our faith as our sense of reality and as our sense of what's around us is really shifting and changing in multitudes of ways. And then also, it's a moment to recognize the things that we are very firmly holding on to. Like, what are we holding on to so dearly that we don't want to change or want to allow to change, or and how are we preventing God from entering that space with us, and like helping us to walk through whatever that change might be, or understand why we're so attached. So like this whole method of discernment and our perception of reality is really really present in that road to Emmaus story. Carla?
Thanks to both of, like all of you. I was just thinking when both of you were sharing the story that you were feeling that you were in, just my own reflection about like, what does the empty tomb mean to me? Right. And I remember I've heard stories where sometimes maybe a new ministry, the next step wasn't exactly what I thought it would be. And I was just disappointed. And this actually happened last week. And then Rob goes, yes, that was sabotage. That's great. It's the best thing that could have happened to them. And so I think when I hear like the word empty tomb, and like, well, what is my empty tomb? And when did I look at it one way when it was really a different way? And then Alexandra, when you're talking about the road to Emmaus, right away, I was like, I wonder where it's going. I wonder what the destination is. And then I'm like, oh, that doesn't matter. It's the journey, right? So it was really interesting, even within the stories, what are the metaphors or what are the pieces? And another question that I started to raise to myself is not just the story, but when have I been one of the characters? When have I been Mary? And when have I been Judas? And when have I been someone else? Rebecca, any of the characters, any gender, of how have I been in that place and in that role.
Yeah, thanks, Carla. And just to clarify, it was not some kind of wish for the destruction of the congregation, but that often things that we think are negative are actually signs of change and the readiness for change, and sometimes sabotage is part of that. So that's another one. Some of the negative stories might be actually positive stories for our time. But where my mind's going right now is often, like, a lot of this question has been around, where is the church? What story is the church in right now? And I think, one of the things we've found is really important in our work is that the focus of attention for Vital Congregations shouldn't be on the church. It's not about us. It's about what God's trying to do in the world. And so it begs the question, what story is the world in that we're a part of? And then your question, Carla, what character are we in? That might be important. And where my mind went was the trees in the hills shall clap their hands. The trees of the hills shall clap their hands, and we shall go out with joy. The sense that creation itself participates in the redemptive act. And the church's focus on, I just remember one of the early things of COVID, we just became much more conscious of creation. And I just see so many people walking now. And that sense of connection and celebration that isn't always there when we're doing this inside on Zoom. Although we can do Zoom, and I have done walking meetings outside, that's all good. But so that's one of and that there are so many stories in the Bible where, and in even parables of Jesus that depend on that connection with the natural world. The wisdom of the trees that plant themselves by flowing streams, right? Like, it's the wisdom of creation. Mountains that are called to bear judgment, to bear witness, and to make judgment in a court case between God and Israel. So lots of interesting stuff.
I think, kind of building off of that, there's this, I don't know what it was, but I was listening to a sermon yesterday, and it really struck me the fact that in the Bible, we're given so many different renditions of the same story, but from different people and different perspectives, and how much we sometimes we lose track of that a little bit in our, in defining what our understanding of our faith or what story we're in today, realizing we can be in the same story, but everyone's experience of that story is going to be different. And the way that we recall it is going to be different. And what we find useful markers in that story is going to be different. And so it was just one of those things where it's like, all of us are mentioning these different stories that we are a part of, and that we feel like we're a part of in different moments, either in our work or in the church or in our lives. And we are finding ourselves in those stories at different times, but with all of these different things that we notice and these different pieces. So as a community, I wonder what it's like to explore, like, individually, one story or one piece of the story, and what are people noticing, I guess, through the Lectio Divina exercise. That's one of the ways people do that. But it's a good reminder to myself to remember the multiplicity that's present. Amen.
Thank you, Alexandria. And what you're saying, and something that Rob was saying too, I think makes me reflect on some of Paul's letters and communicating with these communities that are really struggling, as you say, to find their story, or and wrestling with the stories that they're telling each other, and also not getting it, like being like, you know, I thought this meant that we were all going to be resurrected bodily, but people are like dying and you know, like before, I thought this was already going to happen, and like these expectations around what was supposed to happen and what their ministry meant. And at Edge, we talk a lot, you know, we really have been talking a lot and trying to build up networks where, you know, it's not us as staff, but it's the people that are wrestling with these things in communities, can really share also what they're learning. And sometimes that's learning from mistakes or things that have gone wrong, and learning so that other communities don't have to go through those exact same growing pains, though maybe different growing pains. And I think that it was triggered partially, Rob, with something that you said, like the conflict, or I've heard you say this before too, like the conflict actually means there's energy. And that when we're wrestling with some of these things, like sometimes in that holy unrest and discomfort, that's actually an excellent sign, because it means that, you know, we are invested and communities are invested and members are invested, and there's something at stake, right? Like that it really matters, what we're doing, and that these ministries and communities are really important and do matter. And I wholeheartedly believe that. So I think too about Paul's letters and our the modern day version of networking through Zoom and social media and whatnot. So I will pass it along to Carla there.
Well, you're making me think now what story maybe we might be in, because it was really beautiful how you talked about that conflict, but then you also earlier were talking about all these hopeful stories. And I think as Edge team, we often get to speak with these people who are edgy, and we speak with people who are doing innovative ministries and people who are actually living out and in a different story. And so it's kind of making me think that sometimes our language, we're speaking to each other and we kind of understand, oh yeah, you know, new ministry, innovative ideas, fresh expressions, all this, maybe everything I just said didn't make any sense. So this is like, it reminds me of the Pentecost story, where there's a bunch of people who are all speaking the same language, but it doesn't make any sense to everyone else. And it feels like those people are actually drunk at 9 a.m. And so it's sometimes that feeling of discomfort and the conflict in this time, and yet these people who are all speaking the same language. And so that seems like a really interesting place where there seems to be a lot of people speaking the same language and acting a little drunk at 9 a.m. these days.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I'm gonna take it right to the end of the story in a way. Like I used to think the road to Emmaus was big because I could see this church emerging, like this Jesus with us, and it's not about the grieving, and a lot of disciples walking the road of grief and Jesus with them and not recognizing it. But I'm going with the apocalypse now. I'm going right to, well, partly because, you know, Brian Swim and Thomas Berry did a wonderful kind of bringing together of a theological perspective on apocalypse and what I would call apocalypse and the universe story through scientific cosmology. And they recognizing that this creation of God tends to operate on some principles about evolving towards greater diversity, greater subjectivity, and greater interconnectedness. But there are these moments of transformation, like when the first generation stars collapsed and it gave birth to all of the elements that weren't there yet, which was everything except helium and lithium, and that gave rise to a much more complex universe. When oxygen was, a plant learned to eat the sunlight and started releasing all this oxygen in the atmosphere, and the oxygen just about oxidized everything, just about wiped everything completely out, then gave rise to like this whole new diverse ecosystem of life and diversity, much more, subjective and interconnected and diverse and particular. And those moments of transformation are apocalypse. There's light and opportunity, and there's everything's falling apart, and it's the crap flew and the wind blew and it was hard to see for a day or two, kind of apocalypse, that maybe, are you allowed to say that on this? Anyway, the great news in the midst of this, like we are in one of those moments of transformation, right? Where it's all there right in front of us. And it seems to be hanging like on the balance of a knife edge. And the good news about that is it's God's knife edge, right? And also one small act can make the difference one way or another. Gives us great hope for walking the road of discipleship with faithfulness, for me anyway. So what a great question. What a great question to explore. Thanks for joining us, those that might be watching, and thanks to the three of you for engaging the conversation today.